This episode is sponsored by Quality Horticulture. With Quality Horticulture, you're not just buying supplies, you're investing in decades of expertise and a commitment to your success. Visit qualityhort.com to learn more and browse their vast catalog of leading brands. Hello and welcome to Grow Opportunity, the podcast. I'm your host, Haley Nagasaki. I'm the editor of Grow Opportunity magazine, and we have a special on the US election, what it means for cannabis. I am so delighted to introduce our guests. We've got Rob Laurie, who is a returning guest, and Rob's been a lawyer in the cannabis space in Vancouver forever. He is the founder of Ad Lucem Law Corporation in beautiful British Columbia. He's the Bob of the North, if you will. And Bob Hoban is a Denver-based attorney, cannabis attorney at Clark Hill. He's also a consultant, an industry expert. He's a professor at American universities. He's been an attorney for 25 years in the cannabis space, and he has now stepped away from the law to work as an executive at international cannabis supply chain companies. So welcome to both of you. And how are you guys doing today?
Excellent.
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Even better that I get to do this with Rob. Thanks for the invitation, Haley.
Yeah,
Thanks for having us.
nice to meet you. So, as everyone knows, on Tuesday, November 5th, we are holding a presidential election in the United States between the Democratic leader, Kamala Harris, and the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. So both candidates' stance on marijuana have oscillated in recent years, though it's my understanding that Harris could now be advocating for legalization. Many North Americans vote on matters related to their businesses, but they also tend to align with the party where they think their dollar will go further. So I feel like that means anything could happen. So first, I want to talk about the recent rescheduling that's happened. And Bob, I'm going to hand it over to you. I feel like it's a step in the right direction, but it is in accordance with an old legal framework, and I feel like we need something a little bit newer. So I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So this process within the last year and a half, 2 years, plus or minus, began by virtue of a directive from the White House where President Biden said, hey, HHS, Health and Human Services, which is the body under our FDA, our Food and Drug Administration, that's responsible for evaluating where things are scheduled or whether they should be scheduled at all. He made a mandate. He says, HHS, I'm directing you. You're in the executive branch. I control the executive branch. I am asking you to consider whether cannabis is properly scheduled as a Schedule I substance under the Controlled Substances Act, meaning it has no potential, no medicinal value and a very high potential for abuse. In other words, it's a blight on society, worse than cocaine and heroin and things of that nature. So just doesn't seem to fit there based on what we know scientifically. So HHS comes back about 11 months after that mandate, and they issued a 255-page report, which is telling in that for the first time in U.S. history, the U.S. federal government's recognizing that cannabis does indeed have medicinal value, recognizing international studies, and recognizing data that's been aggregated in the state programs in the U.S., which have served in the face of federal illegality, because it's a Schedule I substance you can't legally sell. Not like Canada, where we have a federal legalization administered through, the FDA equivalent in Canada, Health Canada, of course. So it's not like that. The states are doing what they want in the United States, and the federal government says marijuana is illegal and it has no value. HHS says no, it should be rescheduled. Now, reschedule it to Schedule III. There's an upside to that. We can talk about some of those details in a moment, but there's also a downside to that. We can talk about that as well. Point being is the process is moving forward. Many saw this and see this as an election day ploy. It very well may be, considering this week is the Democratic National Convention in the U.S., and the discussion on the ground has been by the middle of October, you're going to see the final rules on Schedule III move forward. So in other words, just a couple of weeks before Election Day, if you care about marijuana, look what we, the Democrats, did for you. We relaxed the restrictions around marijuana. It's now Schedule III, and here's how it's going to move forward. So that's kind of the lay of the land, generally speaking, and how we got to where we are today. Of course, it has a lot of implications, but Rob, I'd be interested also in your take of just your perception, your perspective, your view of this from north of the border.
Well, thank you, Bob. It's crazy that cannabis has effectively been prohibited by the U.S. federal government for a little over 100 years now. And when you look at the origins of how cannabis, at least in Canada, ended up on the restricted drugs list, it was pretty much snuck in there with heroin or opium, excuse me. And the pushing measure was, well, there was pressure from the United States associated with the anti-alcohol temperance movement. So, we really need to look at, well, why did cannabis end up there in the first place? It was also against the backdrop of racism. I mean, this is, there's examples on both sides of the border. In British Columbia, we have the Asian Exclusion Act and how cannabis was used as hash and opium were effectively used to go after and prevent Asian immigration in the last century. Moving forward, you need to jump to the 1970s, where effectively there's been recent evidence, which John Conroy shared with the group at the Unicorn Cup, that when we look at the Nixon administration, the demonization of cannabis being effectively the poster child of counterculture drugs, along with the psychedelics, which, again, they were in lawful, useful medical study and utility in Canada, with work going back to the 50s, but all of that came to a screeching halt. And ultimately, the controlled drugs and substances framework that we're grappling with today is rooted in those injustices and inequities discussed earlier. So despite the fact that now we may be looking at finally Kamala Harris coming around to cannabis, of course, she's had a history of flip-flopping on the issue, going back to her days as Attorney General for the state of California. But now recently, and I agree totally, Bob, with your timing and the assessment and where we are with cannabis, with the legalization in Canada, rightly noted, and you're seeing international jurisdictions like Germany lead on this. It hasn't led to the crumbling of society. So ultimately, I'm glad we're having this discussion, because in order for the cannabis industry to go forward, even in the Canadian context, ultimately the controlled drugs and substances framework at the international level, the US federal level, which ultimately will impact everybody at the national levels of their countries, which, my view, just to sum up, is kind of at that point will be at ground zero, where, at that point, perhaps a cannabis industry with insurance, banking, regulation, clear treaty and convention on this outside of scientific research and medical access. So I think the future is bright, and we may very well be at the juncture where, the signaling of the descheduling to Schedule 3, along with where we're at in American views on cannabis, I think anything's possible. And just to throw in a bit on Trump here, I always thought that there was a very strong chance that Trump would have done something in the previous administration. I mean, at the end of the day, Trump only thinks of himself. And I would have thought, jokingly, the only place you would have been able to have bought cannabis would be at the Donald Trump Sharper Image stores right next to the Donald Trump branded steaks. But he didn't do it. So it'll be interesting to see how he can reconcile a cannabis policy with his Republican, I don't want to call it right wing, but it definitely is leaning to a right favor, how he'll be able to reconcile that with the liberal views and attitudes traditionally associated with cannabis as a community and more recently as an industry.
So what's the likelihood?
Just a quick note on the Trump thing. I would say, I mean, Trump created a $23 billion hemp industry in the United States when he signed our Farm Bill into act.
That's right.
So he's no stranger to business around cannabis. But to your point, Rob, are the Republicans, the more conservative party, the more right-leaning party, are they the ones that are willing to sort of take the leap and say, you know what, we know what we've been saying about cannabis all these years, but it's okay if we go out and create a framework for it to make some money, draw some tax revenue, et cetera. So that'll be the interesting thing to watch. But the last note I'll say on the R's versus the D's, to your point, you detailed Harris's history and Biden. Biden is probably the worst offender. I mean, Biden created the 3 strikes rule, which incarcerated literally the 3 strikes rule, which was promulgated by Biden when he was a senator, sent more brown and black people, people of color, to jail. It completely shifted our federal prisons landscape from the majority being Caucasian to people being from minority communities. That was Joe Biden. He led that effort. Harris, prosecutor, attorney general. So the Democrats are no friends of cannabis. Don't make any mistake here. However, they have a social justice approach to it largely, whereas the Republicans that have spoken in favor of it have spoken about it more in favor of a business approach. So anybody's guess what's going to happen next is going to happen next. But election day will be telling, and there's a lot of work to be done, because I don't think that you're going to see federal legality. I think that you're going to see this continued patchwork with federal policy that says Schedule 3. We can talk about what that means, but it doesn't create compliant cannabis businesses. It doesn't do that. It's not like Canada, where these are going to be nationally registered businesses. There's a possibility there, but it's wonky. But also, this is in line with the United Nations changes. In November of 2020, the UN convention changed. It changed to recognize medicinal cannabis for the first time. And why did it move forward on that? Not to exaggerate the U.S.'s importance here, but the U.S. government came in and said, yes, we support this change.
We support it.
So the other nations that maybe had an opinion one way or the other, they typically abstain from a vote when the U.S. doesn't take a vote. Not because they want to stay in the U.S.'s good graces for reasons that you and I don't fully understand, but it's the truth, right? So they said, the U.S. comes in and says, yes, we favor the recognition under the UN Convention of Medicinal Cannabis somehow, some way. And that moved forward. So all of this stuff is working together, but does it create an over-the-counter marketplace that's federally legal in the U.S.? Not so much, not so fast.
So Trump was the one who created the hemp, and so the over-the-counter market is the hemp beverages and the edibles and that kind of thing below 5 milligrams THC, correct? Like of hemp products.
Yeah, beverages, gummies, vapes, you name it. Every
I want to talk about
intoxicating
that.
compound, yeah.
And it's interesting because there's 2 questions of who's going to get in, and then what will their stance be for or against cannabis, and we're not going to know because it's the Dems don't want to push away the Republicans and vice versa, so no one's really taking a stance as far as I can tell. And so like we were saying, like it's 2 sides of the same coin, hemp and cannabis. Hemp is legal, and then 2 sides of the same coin, Dems and Republicans. It's very complex, but I want to talk a little bit about the hemp market and what's happening over the counter. And if the Republicans are no stranger to this already, then how will that, maybe move the needle towards introducing marijuana as a business for them?
Yeah, I mean, the hemp industry, I've written a lot about this. I call it red state weed when you're talking about intoxicating compounds from the hemp plant, because it has taken hold in more of these conservative, red-focused political states. There's not stigma attached to hemp. There's stigma attached to marijuana. Same exact compounds, same exact plant, in different ratios of cannabinoids. But of course, if you concentrate those cannabinoids in a beverage, as you point out from hemp, it produces an intoxicating effect or a high. It does. 5 milligrams is going to do that all day long and twice on Sundays. So the red states have seemed to embrace this. They're much more free in terms of business-friendly marketplaces. They're much more friendly in terms of taxation than these dispensary systems, but they're low-dose products. They're not high-dose products like you would get if you walk into a dispensary. And I would, be interested to see how Schedule 3 effectively eliminates the notion of adult use cannabis or recreational cannabis. If I go to Schedule 3, that flower that whether I use the flower in its natural state or I produce something from it, The flower needs to be for a medicinal purpose and a medicinal supply chain. Well, how do I do adult use then? How do I say I'll sell this flower to you or its oil if you're 21 or older? That doesn't fit with any rendition of a Schedule III medicinal compound.
Medicinal
So
use.
you need an over-the-counter product that's descheduled to fill the void of adult use. So what's descheduled? What produces a high? What's already sold over the counter? Hemp derivatives. So this is the battle that's happening in the US. It's become known as the Civil War. The marijuana sector fighting against the hemp sector because they're saying, well, that's too easy. What you're doing is too easy. It's like a liquor store. We had to spend millions and zillions of dollars, and we have to have all the security and cameras in place, and you guys can just produce this and sell it over the counter. That's not fair. And then they're making up things, saying, oh, the hemp is unregulated, the hemp is not safe. No, 17 states have regulated hemp production. So this is a battle that defies logic and reason in the United States, but many political things do.
Well, the fact there's the rescheduling and then acknowledgement of medicinal use, medicinal access from a legal jurisprudence point of view, one of the main ways, and this is John Conroy spoke to this at the Unicorn Cup, was in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 7 deals with the issue of security of the person and medical access, medical choices, and considerations involving medical decisions. Ultimately, that comes into freedom of, well, the right to life, liberty, security of the person. So perhaps there's a way now in the US to use the equivalent of Section 7 in the US jurisprudence, because now there is, I guess, just by virtue of the statute, a recognition of medical use. Medical use has greater constitutional entrenchment and standing, certainly in Canada, more so than recreational commercial cannabis. And thirdly, the medical piece is acceptable and permissible both under the CDSA framework nationally and internationally. So in many ways, has the federal government done themselves any favors? If anything, it may be the way to look at this, that, it's even more ambiguous and perhaps very ripe for challenge in US federal courts. Now, given that up the scheduling has led to greater constitutional entrenchment of the substance in issue, and if the context for the use involves the commercialization of a medical access point, then perhaps the United States may be able to achieve a more perfect medical market than the ease and access of rec in Canada, which is significantly more expensive than cannabis through a medical system. So I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts on all of that, Bob.
Yeah, look, you have to figure out, Europe has moved pretty far on this, and so has Canada, to your point. You have to figure out how a product that could be potentially consumed by inhalation fits within a medical framework. You have to figure out how these products can enter into the mainstream. When we look at the Controlled Substances Act for substances that are below Schedule II in the US, it does not require a physician. It requires something called a practitioner. So practitioner is a much more broad definition. It includes doctors, but it's not limited to doctors. So a practitioner has to issue an order, quote unquote order. So what's an order? Is an order a prescription? Is an order a recommendation? Is an order just sitting in the office and saying, hey, patient X, this will help you? That's the debate. And these things are not really that well defined under federal law. So there is a way that this could work federally and comply, but we just don't know how it's going to go. And then, of course, the industry clamors for descheduling. Well, all of the comments, 49,000 comments, had to do with descheduling and support of this move. But descheduling was never really a real possibility from a government agency. That's a political move. politicians in Congress tomorrow could vote to deschedule marijuana in all of its forms, or create a rule where natural flower, or maybe there's different percentages, and then concentrated oils are a medicine, but they haven't done that. So because they haven't done that, we're left to figure out what's going to happen when we keep trying to jam this square peg into this round hole and see if it fits. And that's what we're doing over and over and over again. So I admire, as much as the Canadian approach feels a little bit overregulated and overtaxed, and maybe that's stymied its progress in the global marketplace after
Well,
an
that's
initial
everything
bust out.
Canadian these days, overtaxed and overregulated. Cannabis is just a very good representation of that dichotomy of issues.
But at least the federal government on a national level has taken a stand and moved forward with it, whether that becomes a Trudeau campaign promise or whether there was momentum prior to that. I don't follow Canadian politics at any deep level, so I don't know the answer to that question, except to say I admire the fact that there was gusto and a legislative process to get it done on a federal level and put Canada on the map properly. Now, a lot of those dollars have dried up behind it, but that's not so much a Canadian problem. That's just inefficiencies in the global marketplace where billions of dollars of money that went through the Canadian stock markets went, and now it's all gone, largely gone. But that's not any fault of Canada or the mechanism through which the dollars came in the door. It's a fault of the fact that the global marketplace was so immature and has yet to really develop and have a chance.
There was a very good chance Canada was going to legalize as early as 1972 following the Ledane Commission. I mean, have to remember you had John Lennon and Yoko Ono show up and speak to that, along with educators, politicians, activists, criminal justice reformers. But the big interesting thing, the big reason why cannabis was never legalized until when it was, and it was always very surprising that Washington State, Colorado led the charge on this, is you had Canadian senators and politicians saying, they would be asked the question, when are we going to legalize cannabis? They would laugh and say, literally, let Senator Larry Campbell, who's the former mayor of Vancouver, we legalize cannabis, the border with the United States will be shut down. And, they used to say there were more pot growers than hockey players at one time, at least in British Columbia. But it's interesting that, Canada did what it did, sure, being the first G7 country, but I don't think they would have it would have been on the agenda, but for Washington and Colorado. And I know you had a big part in that. So here we are.
Rob, something that you said at the Unicorn Festival was that, like, in what other industry is the regulator, the tax man, and then is also competing against the industry itself? Like, I don't think that they don't feel like a friend.
Well, that would be a good question for Bob, because, I said that at least in British Columbia, you have the province regulates the distribution, which is effectively the sales. And so they have tapped. You can only, if you're an independent retailer, you can have a max of 8 stores. Provincial government has 37, 38 stores. The provincial government also directly competes with the independent stores by the brick and mortar government and online sales. The government is also able to buy cannabis at, they have the bargaining power as well. They're not paying the taxes and so on. So that all being said, yes, cannabis seems to be one of the few industries where the private sector who, lobbied for the change is effectively
competing against.
Exactly. Directly competing and taxing them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, do you see that, Bob, in Colorado, for example? I mean, when I was there, I don't think I saw state-owned stores that were, again, and operators directly competing with the licensed market.
No, the government across the U.S., and there's very few exceptions, very few, but largely the business operations are all private enterprise. They're licensed by the government, but the government in some jurisdictions might have a stake in the outcome of those businesses. And particularly at the local level, local jurisdictions tend to drive those bargains. But no, there's no competition from the marketplace between the government and the private sector. But also the bureaucrats that sort of oversee the state-based licensing scheme, they tend to come from different molds. Some are business bureaucrats that are there to just say, hey, here's the forms, tell me how I can help you. Some think of their job a little bit more seriously, and they're sort of regulators with guns. Like, quite literally, in Colorado, the Department of Revenue, these are guys that sit behind desks all day, but for some reason they carry guns because they work for the Department of Revenue. So you get a little bit of that when you interact with that agency. It's not, here, how can I help you? It's, here's what the rules say. And if you don't comply with the rules, I'm just saying I have this thing on my hip here. Yeah. So it's a little bit odd in that regard. But no, there's not that kind of competition. But, it also begs the question of, is federal legalization in the United States a good thing? I'm not so sure it is, because we're going to see how Schedule 3 shakes out. I don't think the states are free to do what they want. That's the way our Constitution is set up and our nation is set up. The states are a test of democracy. The states can quite literally do just about anything they want to do. And if it works and other states start to adopt it, over time, the federal government will adopt it. So it's not like the federal government generally comes in and says, hey, states, stop doing this, although those issues do come up regularly, and they tend to be political based. So federal legalization could make this purely a pharmaceutical play, purely a go to your doctor and get a pill play. That continues to foster the black market or the illicit market or the underground market, however you want to describe it. Because if I want my cannabis flower, I'll be damned if the law is going to tell me I have to go to a doctor and get a pill for the same effect. So that's where things are kind of shake out in the U.S. But, a lot of it is just doesn't make sense. A lot of it just is progress that's happening in this patchwork level. And then when it filters up, it just kind of falls flat. And there's no motivation at the federal level. I remember when Mitt Romney ran against Barack Obama for the presidency several years ago. There was a debate here in Denver, Colorado. And one of the reporters from our Denver Post cannabis publication asked Mitt Romney after the debate, so tell me a little bit about your cannabis policy. Do you believe what we're doing here in Colorado makes sense? Something like that. Romney looked at the reporter, conservative, and said, ask me something real. This is not a real question for the president of the United States. You can't do that in this day and age. You have to have a cogent perspective on cannabis, even if it's just, yes, I support medicinal cannabis, like a lot of the Republicans tend to say. So my point is we've evolved. So federal policy matters, but federal legalization, I don't necessarily think is a good thing because it allows big business, big pharma to succeed. But it also allows us to participate in international commerce like Canada, which is where most of the activity is right now, considering what Germany's done and what these European countries are doing, making cannabis free and accessible to its general population on a federal level.
So interesting. Okay, so with Schedule 3, will that open up the borders in the United States for commerce in terms of medical cannabis?
So if I try to go get a Schedule 3 license, we don't know if the DEA is going to give us that license.
Okay.
And it all depends on what type of operation I'm trying to run. If I'm a cultivator, am I positioned to get a DEA registration under Schedule 3? Yeah, I think you are. Likewise, if you're a manufacturer of products and extraction, I think that you're also in a position. I think retail is where this kind of falls flat a little bit in terms of being federally compliant. But here's the rub. Let's say I get that federal cultivation registration or that federal manufacturing registration. Guess what? I can only sell to other Schedule 3 licensees or the equivalent on the international level. So instead of being able to grow a bunch of cannabis and sell it into dispensaries, unless those dispensaries are also DEA registered, I can't sell to them anymore. So it's going to be, well, do I want to be federally compliant? Because if I do, I might not make any money because there's just not as many buyers out there as there are when I'm not federally compliant. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you think it's going to happen? I mean, you just said you don't know if it's a good idea, but do you think in the future on one side or the other, do you think that it might happen?
Do I think that I think the systems ultimately do merge. I think that ultimately
have to reconcile.
You have to reconcile. In the international level, they do there's a lot less of this distinction between hemp and marijuana it's all cannabis. And then the cannabis is regulated by its uses. And there's exceptions to that if it's purely industrial. But if I'm going to put anything in my body, even if it's just for protein or omega-3s versus cannabinoid content, then there's largely going to have to be some sort of synergy between the two sectors, and it all should be cannabis regulated pursuant to its uses. If it's low dose in beverages and gummies, maybe even, I don't know how you low dose flower. We see that experiment with THCA flower in the United States. I think flower ends up in dispensaries. I think low dose over the counter finished retail goods ends up being the new adult use. They're derived from hemp, and then higher concentrated forms of cannabis are sold in dispensaries. It's not unlike I'm familiar with this, but many grocery stores in the US sell beer, but it's called 3.2% beer versus whatever 5.5+ % beer that usually. So we're used to a two-tiered system here where some things are low dose and sold more openly. So I think that's the way it goes.
Well,
But
you also have liquor stores selling wild turkey just a few aisles down, which I always marvel of. You can judge a lot from a country on what they will sell at their Costco. And you look at what American Costco sell that you will never see in Canada, like firearms, cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, and a whole bunch of other things that the government's afraid of us getting our hands on. But no, it's quite interesting, the differences.
You mentioned
I mean,
bank.
I expect that we will see weed in American Costco's before we will see them in Canadian Costco's. That is my prediction.
I mean, there's cigarettes.
Whenever that happens.
I think you're right. I do think that you'll start. I mean, we know that professional sports arenas have green lighted the sale of these beverages. We know that Live Nation, big concert events, have green lighted the sale of these products. We know that over 5,000 liquor stores across the country hold these low dose Delta-9 hemp derived beverages. The question becomes, to your point, does that end up in a 30-pack that I can buy at a Costco or a broader retail outlet? I think Canada is probably going to be the first to that. But you know what? You just never know. Political leadership comes in weird shapes and sizes, and economics and consumer behavior usually drives that discussion. It would not surprise me at all, no matter who wins our presidency, if they see this clamor towards Schedule 3 and they see they really start to then look at the consumer numbers, and then the people in Washington, D.C. are interfacing with people from Amazon and Procter and Gamble, not people from the existing closed loop marijuana sector. And all of a sudden they start listening to them and say, oh, wait a second, here's what consumers want. Here's what we're doing. Oh, it's not so dangerous, is it? No. So it depends who you hear, like a child or a teenager. Who tells you the message, that's how you receive it. Same thing with politicians.
Agree.
Do you want to do some predictions, either of you guys, for what's going to happen with the election and what it might mean for cannabis?
I'll do a prediction. I mentioned this when we were talking, Haley, and it doesn't always make my partisan friends happy. I tend to be an independent, more libertarian minded, meaning less government, more freedom.
Yeah.
That cuts across the Republican and the Democrat aisles. I think that America usually comes down into three different buckets. You've got 1/3 that are going to vote Democrat no matter what. 1/3 are going to vote Republican no matter what. Then you have all these people in the middle, where I do find myself oftentimes. So what's going to get me out of my seat to vote that day? This is why when you see these terrible political ads and American television, it's about these salacious issues, because I'm trying to get the person off his or her butt, to get out and vote. So what's going to get them excited or mad that day? That's why we talk about abortion rights. That's why we talk about, the racial divide in America. You talk about these issues, you tend to get people motivated. So then they pick the candidate that is going to do that. And that's how that middle third ends up. And it's usually about 51-49 when it all shakes out. All right. I think the issue, things are so expensive in America today. It doesn't mean it's Joe Biden's fault, but he's been president for 3.5 years. So people are going to blame the Biden administration, the Democrats, for the fact that now it costs almost 2.5 times to go to the grocery store that it cost 3 years ago. Like, that doesn't stand. Gas is $1.50 more than it is under Republican leadership. I think people are going to vote with their wallets, and I think people want money for vacations, money for their families, and that would be my bet, is that the Republicans win this election by a narrow margin because of that middle third voting with their wallet. Now, how does that affect cannabis? At the end of the day, I believe that as we see this, Trump created the $23 billion hemp industry, so he's got to own that. So if that becomes that, by the way, Republicans win, then that definitely becomes the new adult use. And the Schedule 3 part of it probably becomes a little bit more focused on the pharmacy side. So that's how I see things unfolding. Most people don't like to hear that because I'm not picking Donald Trump. I'm telling you that I see Americans, your average American is going to vote that way, and that's how I think things will ripple effect. It would surprise me greatly if Harris does win this election, just because of the economic issues, and frankly, she's gained some momentum, but she doesn't seem to be globally liked. That's hard to think about that. We're saying that a successful female from California who's a lawyer and has this track record, she's not globally liked compared to Donald Trump, who, need I say anything about liking the guy? I mean, it's a weird juxtaposition, but that's American politics in a nutshell. Tune in for season 3 of The Office.
We'll be there. I mean,
Yeah.
too, just being so new to the race, that's difficult as well. But Rob, what's your perspective?
So, okay, I don't endorse either. These are strictly my read of the signs of the times and sort of my prophetic view of the situation. And you talk about in law, judicial activism, right? Where you've got more activist judges versus less activist judges. Everything goes in peaks and troughs. And what have we seen over the last certainly 10 years with Justin Trudeau? In states like California under Gavin Newsom, for example, there has been this left, if you would, left momentum, which, with everything been going on since COVID, it's, I think, left the left wing and the Democrats in a compromised position. On top of the fact that, you have Trump and his running mate, two white men. I mean, I can't remember the last time two white men ran in that platform in recent years because of issues of diversity and so on. So it's almost like they're doubling down to appeal to traditional bases of support. And in many ways, America, North America, Canada, it's gotten too left wing, right? Too woke, whether you support that or not. And we're definitely due for an overcorrection. And so in Canada, they, of course, Pierre Poilievre are conservative, which is sort of center right, hardly right wing. But one of the attacks that the liberal left are on is that Poilievre and Donald Trump style politics are one and the same. But that's a whole debate in and of itself. But I think, both camps can capitalize on exactly what Bob identified, the fact that the cost of living, now whether that's caused by domestic or international, it seems almost like our respective leaders are incompetent or impotent with respect to their abilities to deal with the rising costs. You then have these issues of foreign election interference and the rise of China. And again, that's led to, in Canada, feelings of the left perhaps is compromised. You do see that in the States with the whole Biden connection, Hunter Biden. I mean, let's not even go there. But I think Americans, like Canadians, are fed up. And these are easy scapegoats. The Democrat Party did not do themselves any favor having an incompetent Joe Biden in position. I mean, love him or hate him, but it was very clear he could not continue 4 years. So I think, again, Trump will capitalize on that. And in addition, we haven't even talked about the religious right. There's an opportunity right there for cannabis and Christian evangelical practices almost to collide. I mean, the Bible, it's full of references to cannabis and cannabism. And in many ways, the association of medical and faith-based approaches to cannabis may very well be a way forward. And, the third avenue on this is First Nations and Indigenous. I mean, I'm not sure which way they will vote, but when it comes to cannabis, you're seeing, at least I'm hearing more and more about Indigenous groups in the, southwestern United States, right up to our borders, doing some very interesting and sophisticated things with cannabis and exercising their sovereignty. So prediction is, I do think that the Trump government will get in by a minority, or no, by a squeaky margin. I also think that you have this assassination attempt, which, the end of the day, Trump could very well capitalize on divine providence. I think they have done a good job underplaying all of that. But again, I think that whole sort of Christian right-wing base voter is going to vote the way they're going to vote. Any of the demographics in the middle that haven't made up their mind will vote either with their wallet, their faith, or the fact that they want to see a return to white picket fences, American pie, and baseball America. And I think, the Trump JD Vance ticket, rightly or wrongly, is promoting a return to that illusion of America, just as the lefts, though, or the Democrats, are pushing this illusion of equality, inclusion, diversity, which there's a time and a place, but I think it's being done to the extent of real tangible economic and political progress, which ultimately is making it more difficult for cannabis to come to the foreground as an issue. So really, I don't think cannabis is going to play much of a huge role. I think the lefts are going to hang it out there to see, or the Dems are going to hang it out there to see, hey, do we get traction? But again, look at all the support for cannabis in red states, and case in point, Arizona.
Right.
Which, again, could very well vote Trump easily again. And whether weed's an issue or not, Texas is voting red. So again, Donald Trump with a narrow margin.
There's some similarities between Canada and the US in that way, in terms of economics. And, 1 in 4 Canadian families are now visiting food banks. And I think that at the end of the day, when
poverty.
Poverty. When you look at your kids, you're going to vote that way. And I think, too, I was talking to a CEO of a cannabis company on the West Coast recently, and she's like, well, we're competing with the grocery bill at this point. Like, so I think those things need to correct themselves, and then this stuff will come secondary. But the cannabis industry, it's here, it's not going anywhere. The genie's not going back in the bottle. I don't think in either places. So that's good. And
if anything, I think the liberals who aren't doing anything with cannabis, right? The conservatives are for business.
Yep.
If anything, I think, they're not going to just allow the industry to sink into irrelevancy. I've always thought, hey, get a change of leadership, a change of approach. And had we done this in 2019 or 2021 in those elections where I wanted Trudeau gone so bad because the cannabis industry was so stagnant, the blood was on the floor as early as 2019, and it's only languished. So my hope, right, is that we'll see changes there. But what does that mean for the U.S.? Anyone's guess.
Anyone's guess.
So season 3, mid-late November, we'll meet back here and unpack the events. Is there anything else you guys want to add? That was awesome.
I just would say that, it is progress to move forward, particularly in the US, with a different treatment of this plant, to recognize it has medicinal value. It's just, unfortunately, it's a politicized issue now. In terms of the hemp versus marijuana, but the industry is cannibalizing itself as well. So those are the things that really seek to undermine the progress we've made in the United States. I thought that we would be in a position to have these discussions now about where to sell these products, but not surrounding hemp. I thought it was going to be about a descheduled form of marijuana, higher THC products. But we're at the same juncture, having to make the same decisions. We just have to be patient and see how things play out. And the industry needs to be aligned, because if it's not aligned, hemp and marijuana, I mean, think about this. The marijuana sector is partnering up with prohibitionist forces to get rid of hemp. That sounds like a deal with the devil, if you ask me, and that usually doesn't work out so well with the person who makes the deal with the devil, but only time will tell.
That's a nail biter. That's
Yeah,
a hanger to end on.
I think the US has to, or the states that are legal in the US have to do greater efforts in terms of collectively making the change and getting the change before the federal government, because effectively the international cannabis market and cannabis as an industry, really, I feel the cuffs are still on. And the cuffs, whether they're golden or not, has all been led by US efforts, whether you want to call it propaganda or a protection of American national interests. But ultimately, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Framework, which is based on the former narcotic control regulations, it was all based out of paranoia, fear, xenophobia, racism, and with the admission recently, John spoke about this with Halderman and Ehrlichman, on record that, we did this to demonize. What frustrates me is all of this evidence and information and knowledge about cannabis is there. I mean, Sanjay Gupta can't get any more open than that. And yet the conversation with American elected officials is almost like there's filters or certain words and phrases that are acceptable and what aren't. So I really encourage you, Bob, and the circles that you're traveling in to figure out ways to turn up the attention and the heat with the U.S. federal government, because I honestly think that, any industry that still has these barriers and boundaries and just weight on top of it is going to struggle and flounder. And the Canadian cannabis industry, I think, can only grow as far and as fast that the elephant we're the mouse with the cannabis industry, but we can only grow and move as fast as the elephant south of the border and their international and domestic drug policies, aka the CDSA. All of that needs to be rolled back to where we can, I think, really begin to have an industry that we can be proud of, and that does meet both the medical and commercial rec cannabis use. I am optimistic. I mean, we have seen a long way from the days of where there were only 2 international offices for the DEA outside of the US. One was Bogota, Colombia, and the other was Vancouver, Canada, largely due to the efforts of Mark Emery and a handful of activists, which ended up, they crashed an event where U.S. drug czar, I believe his name was Walter Stockton. Anyway, he showed up at this event, said a bunch of things about how cannabis was all very harmful. And the activists were literally going, bullshit, bullshit, lies, lies, lies. This DEA drug czar, did not know who Mark Emery was before he arrived in Vancouver. He certainly knew who he was before he left. And a few months later, you had the infamous Vancouver 3, who were raided by masked and armed DEA officials in the name of American public health, public safety, and national security. So I like to think we've evolved from those days. We certainly have. And I do expect huge things from the legal U.S. industry. So yeah, watch this space, I think.
Thank you both so much. I would be delighted to talk about this again as it relates to cannabis after the election, but also psychedelics, because I feel like there's lots to discuss there as well.
Happy to join again, and always happy to join. Rob and Haley, thank you for your time, and hopefully people like what we have to say, or if they don't, even better. That's
Yeah.
sometimes you're doing your job as a lawyer when people don't like what you're saying.
Well, the cool thing is we've got footage, right? So Haley can like run the clips of like, you said this in August, Trump, and then we can like see, But anyway, yeah, Haley, well done, and Bob, always a pleasure, and thank you both for the opportunity.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks, guys.